Welcome to episode 25 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage your global websites. In our last episode, we talked about why it's critical to make SEO a team sport. Whether you're a CEO or on a digital team, I suggest you check that out. In this episode, we're going to discuss the complexities and confusions around HREFLang Default element. If you run an international website, target different regions, or you just want to improve your global presence, this episode is going to be for you. We're going to be unpacking what the Default tag does, why it matters, common mistakes, and the article that I just wrote. So why don't we get started? Bill, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So, I was asked this question about Default, and, I've been doing this for a while. I knew the answer, but I thought, and, we typically do this, like, well, how can I break it? What are all the weird ways you could use this properly or improperly? And so I ended up writing an article, which will be out by the time we publish this podcast. But before we start talking about some of that stuff, I just want to get your take on what you might have seen as far as people doing this improperly.
That's a big one. I think it's the simplest, most misunderstood, and one of the biggest errors that I come across with companies. And I think the take is people really don't understand what its purpose is. And you do a great job in the article of articulating the purpose. So I'll let you cover that. But I think that's number one. People don't understand it. I think they may intuitively know what it does, but then they have to try to overlay it on the chaos that is their global website. And I think that's where the problem comes in. So, this is actually episode 25. So, 25 episodes in, we've talked about many of the reasons why there's a lot of dysfunction on global websites. And it's that very dysfunction, especially when things are decentralized, that create many of the challenges that we see with Default. And so that's what I see. I mean, I probably get 2 to 5 questions a week, either on LinkedIn or from people I've known saying, hey, this is what we have. It doesn't seem to be working. And then you go look at it. Or, it's that sort of quirk we have as search people. Anytime we touch somebody's website, we do a view source. And I always take a look at any international sites, HREFLang implementation, and it's huge how many people get this wrong for various reasons. So that's my take. And that's why in our training, so shameless plug, in our errors course, we have 3 or 4 modules where we talk about the types of errors, which we're going to cover today with HREFLang Default. And then based on your article and some others that we've written in the past, I'm building out a whole big training module, both a dedicated one to Default and then extending the module we have in our big masterclass on HREFLang, on implementing HREFLang. So because it does continue to be a reoccurring problem.
I didn't realize you're going to do that. That's great. Yeah. So, basically, I would say that the Default is the fallback. So if you're using HREFLang and you've defined the language regions, if someone doesn't fit those language regions, it's the fallback page. It ensures that users are directed to the most relevant content. It would improve their overall experience. They're not landing on a US page if they're English speaking from another country outside of the US, and you get the opportunity to have a generic page or just decide what page somebody would see when they enter your site, not having been tagged to a region and language. And that the default page doesn't have to be a unique page, not already defined in a HREFLang tag. So it could be a US page, or it could be a global page that you create.
Can I simplify even further?
Yeah, sure.
Because this is exactly why people don't understand how this works and why it works. So when I explain this to people, and usually it's executives who have countermanded what the brilliant dev or SEO team has wanted to do, the question I ask is, if, let's say, you don't have a dedicated website for the country of Tonga or Fiji. Let's go exotic because we got snow and it's cold here. Let's say Fiji. Someone goes in, clickety clacks on Google, looking for whatever you sell from Fiji in English. And the question is, what page should they see? And, let's say you're a Nike and you have, 100, or what do they have? 87 versions, or somebody that has 100 versions. Maybe they don't have a Fiji website. The question is, what should they see? What should Google? And I really want to make that clear. What instructions, this is an instruction to Google to give them something. When we don't have either a language or a market version for people, the amazing people in Fiji, what should Google present in the search results? And so the X default gives us two options. One, we can put up a country language selector and we can say, I'm going to use my country language selector. That was the original purpose of X default, is for you to set that, because so many companies, UPS, I think FedEx and companies still have it today. IKEA, in many cases, they'll either send you into a regional site with IP detection or they dump you on a country selector. And once you select, you're then cookied and you go off on your merry way into the language and market that you select. So this is a way, and that's why Google finally, after many, many years of begging, introduced the word and the phrase fallback, which you used exactly correct. And that's the technical way. When you don't have something that's clearly delineated for them, a language version, or let's say they're French coming in from New Caledonia. They did a query in French. What should a French speaking, and let me pause there because this is actually where people like to pick and choose this. What version of your website should people that you don't have a site present? And there's no setting on your website to do this other than saying my X default is the fallback. There's nothing that goes on to swap it or do anything like that. You can't have IP detection to do it. You can't have language detection to do it. But this is simply an instruction for search engines to say, show this version to that. It was a little longer simplification than what I wanted, but people get the idea. You're simply saying, hey, when I don't have a version for them dedicated to them, this is what I want you to show anybody anywhere in the world. And that's why people make mistakes, because they misconstrue certain things. Like somebody will say, okay, I manage the team for Asia Pacific and I'm sitting in Sydney. And so I control these 12 Asia Pacific sites within our dev cluster. And so on my Australia website, I'm going to set the X default to Australia because, I want people in the region to see Australia. And then what happens when that same HREFLang cluster is linking to the US? And the US team says, no, we're the X default. And guess what? Maybe you actually have a English language website, or you have a non-market designated website like a .com that happens to be in English. And this is where the breakage comes in, because nobody has said, what is our single decisive fallback when we don't have a version of a website for people in the world? It's not in a market, it's in the world.
That goes back to our planning and strategy episode. I think most companies don't think about this when they start off. They start off with one page and they grow into other markets.
And decentralization, and people do regional servers.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a laundry list a mile long, because in the, the errors and, understanding and fixing HREFLang errors course, I go into a variety of these reasons. Why this happens, because I think we have to educate people why these errors occur. By understanding when the errors and what's the root cause of the errors, it can tee you up to mitigate the errors. And I think that's a big thing. You talk about when people start out with this. When you start out with HREFLang, we advocate the first thing we tell people to do in our training. The first thing I've told people to do for almost 12 years, 11 years with HREFLang Builder is build a country language matrix. All right. Simply make a simple, stupid chart that says, here's all my versions of my website. And then in the next column, put the language that it represents. What language is it? Then what market does it target? So as you said, if I've got an English for the UK and an English for Australia and an English for the US, then, and those are delineated, however, folders, domain, CCTLDs, whatever craziness that you use to represent that market or language designator, that pattern is equal to that country or language or that language. And so some of the things you're going to talk about is what do we do when we're a Latin America company and we have, a Spanish and maybe an Argentina and those type of things. And those are nuances that you can see pretty quickly when you build your country language matrix, because then, you've got all these covered. And guess what? If you step back and say, wow, I've covered 47 markets and 5 languages, I think the world is bigger than that. What do the people who speak Swahili? What are the people who speak, whatever it is, Mongolian? Where do we send all these others? Where do we send them? And remember, HREFLang is at a page level. So as Bill alluded to in the intro, you can have, you would set an X default for every single page. And this is one of the other common things we have is people want to, there is no tool that easily allows you to randomly pick and choose stuff. You sort of have to designate something holistically, which is the concept. What is the global fallback? So I think with those things in mind, if we start out with that country language matrix, I think this is really going to help you answer the magical question of what should be our fallback. And I think as if we keep that, that image of that matrix in the back of our mind as we go through these different scenarios, it's going to help you fill in that line item because it literally is a single line item of what is the fallback.
Yeah, one of the common errors I see is different CMS systems basically marking the X default as the CMS systems page. So you'll see, a US site built on the US CMS system, and they'll have their pages to X default, and the UK CMS system designating the UK pages the X default. That breaks it.
Right, because we've got a cluster that's saying A is equal to B.
Yeah.
And then now when you've got the same cluster that's supposed to be mirror image, whether you're using XML sitemaps or you're using tags on the page, that cluster is supposed to be mirror image. So, with the cross-referencing, then then exactly that, it breaks. So, your fallback is then negated. And because the fallback is negated, because in the UK cluster, you said it's the UK, in the US cluster, you say it's the US, it's now, that's taken out. It's as if you didn't have it. And now it's up to the search engine to decide what they would show in, let's say, Ireland. Do they show the US or do they show the UK? Because now we're different currencies, similar language, but there's nuances. Now it's a coin toss on which of these they're going to show because you haven't given an explicit direction. And then I know you've got a bunch of questions about, as well as statements and recommendations around a lot of the chaos that actually is global websites, because there are things we have to consider. And then I'll sort of let you go through your article because you made an amazing table in the article. And I think you had 12, 15 variations, which again is only the tip of the iceberg because of the way people go to market. But I think they're the most common and the ones where I think people struggle with the most. So, I'll let you continue sort of driving this discussion.
Yeah, they unfortunately, the table doesn't lend itself too much to audio. But what I tried to do was I tried to think of all of the strange situations. Well, strange, not strange, but unique situations that people have that they probably wouldn't have if they had a strategy in place. Things from like HREFLang indicate the US English page is the default with the US Spanish as an alternate and Canadian English as an alternate. You can have the fallback as the US if that's what you want to do. And it goes down through different scenarios with blog content, product content. We have language and region hybrids that I handle. There's multiple different Spanish regions, and you would want to pick one of those. Let's say your company was in Spain and you could sell to other Spanish regions. You could pick Spain as the default, or you could have a Spanish language page as a default. I don't know, some of the other things were, let me take a look here. We had language only, which is pretty easy. But what happens if there is no Spanish page and you have three other languages? You'd want to select fallback, probably the English page.
I think that's a great point. And then Martin, when on the Google Search Off the Record podcast a couple episodes ago, when we covered this, he asked the question of John. So let's say I have, an Austrian site and in German and a German site, and I don't, what do I use as my X default?
Whatever
And
you want.
so, if you only have German, then, you can either you don't need to set one. It's not mandatory. So, because again, German is only spoken, and we're not talking about all the, German expats around the world and the wild ass chance that somebody in Fiji is going to search in Germany and German. And, those are when people lose their mind and start thinking about all those crazy if then occasions. And so what the recommendation was is maybe you don't need it. Right? Because does it matter to you? Is there any economic advantage to anyone? A customer in Fiji that, Google's whatever it is, running shoes in German, and you only have 2 German language sites, which one they get? The same with your example with Spanish, right? So let's say you're a Latin America company and your headquarters in Argentina, and maybe you have a site for Peru and a site for Mexico. Do we need an X default? The question is, we don't have to have one. But then again, if we go back to our country language matrix and we say, well, what if somebody from Latin America or Spain, let's say, does this search? Do we have a preference? Is there any advantage to them or to us if one of these 3 sites was the one that Google were to show them? Let's say somebody in Chile. Is there any advantage in Chile of, the Argentina, Peru, or Mexico site being shown? If there's no real advantage, maybe we don't need an X default. But if we say, you know what, we have more selection in Argentina, it's more robust. It is whatever. I want Argentina to be my X default for any other Spanish language or market query. That's what shows up. Then you get into when we have a, multinational, single language, single region website, which is essentially what one of your examples is. We've got Argentina, Peru, and Mexico. Then what do we want them to see? If we don't have English, then obviously, we can't set it to English. So our only choice is to set it to one of the Spanish if we want to use it. If we started with the Spanish and we have sort of this global Spanish, that's one of your examples. I have a global Spanish, which is what I started with. And, as SEOs, we never collapse anything. We never get rid of anything. We're the biggest hoarders in the world. So I've got my global Spanish. I spun off Argentina, Peru, and Mexico. So my X default it logically should be my Spanish language site if I so have one. Don't go create one if you don't have one, because again, you've got 3 market sites that you can pick and choose. Because it's not required, this may be one of those scenarios where you don't use it.
Right.
And so I think that's one. And then, the other one that comes up a lot is, the most common language, I have to be very careful how I state this. The most commonly understood language, not the most spoken or the most used language, but the most commonly understood, tends to be English. And so if you did have a global English site, or you did want to designate one of your English sites to be the fallback, then that makes sense, because now English is something that people are going to be able to understand.
Right.
Again, this is why Martin and them were suggesting that maybe you don't need an X default if you only had 2 German language, or in our other scenario, 3 Spanish language market sites. That, it really may not matter which one Google shows. If it does matter legally, economically, from a business opportunity, pick the one that where you get the biggest advantage to both you and the user, and select that one as the X default. Another one I want you to walk us through is, you mentioned products. You've worked with a lot of companies that, on a global site, and I'm sort of teeing up scenario A, we have a global site where we have our entire product portfolio. We have all 150 gazillion products that we sell anywhere in the world. And then in each market, we only have market products. This creates an interesting scenario that you covered. So do you want to touch on that one when we have what are some of the product scenarios that you covered in this guide that you wrote?
Yeah. So, imagine like most companies, they can only support English language. So you could have a product page for the United Kingdom, you could have a product page for Australia, and you could have a global page for everyone else. And there might be different reasons for that. It might be because you don't want to have pricing on it that would turn someone off if you still sell to those regions. And so in that case, you would basically have your designated pages for Australia and the United Kingdom, and then your X default would be sort of a global product page. So that would be one. And then there's the situations where you don't sell products in every region, but you might have people searching for that product in every region. Some companies might have a global site with all products on the global site and designate where it's sold, versus the regions where they only have the individual product pages. And in that case, you would have all the same product pages, the X default as that global page. But one of the things that I think a lot of people don't get right is the idea of having a virtual root homepage with IP redirection. Have you seen this?
Yeah, it's a
You would have.
huge problem. And so what we're talking about is, let's say you're somebody like, let's use IBM or Nike, any big multinational that's using IP detection, and either this is most common when we use folder structures, right? We've got languages or language and country folder structures. And so, the user hits Nike.com, and most have done this as a 302 redirect. And that's the key. The Nike.com, when somebody puts in, Nike running shoes, and in their market, and Google brings up a result, whatever it is, even if it's the wrong result, the wrong market result, when you click it, it's like, okay, they're in Australia, let's say New Zealand. Maybe there's not a New Zealand site. They're in New Zealand and they speak English. And so our IP logic says we're going to send them to Australia. And so, when they go to Australia, this all works with IP detection. Now, wonder if where the problem Bill's talking about is in New Zealand, because they did Nike running shoes, the global homepage, or especially they put in Nike, right? They just want to know about Nike. The Nike global page, that page that technically doesn't exist because of the redirect, appears. And this can appear in markets, especially if you didn't account for this page this is most common when people use tags. Because remember, Nike.com, that page, that root page, does not technically exist, because anytime anybody tries to visit that, because of their IP, they're redirected elsewhere to a global page, to a market page. But Google still knows about that page. And because of the 50 gazillion links to it, for a query like Nike or even some products, that is technically the best page. And so the way, anyway,
what happens is maybe in the past, or just because of the sheer number of links to Nike.com, Google sees that as the homepage.
That is the epitome of Nike.
What's that?
And because it's the epitome, it is the poster child of all things Nike.
Right, but there is no page.
There's technically no page.
Yeah.
There is a page, but because we've used a 302 redirect, that's a temporary. That means at some point we're expecting the page to come back. So the way Google, really all search engines treat this is they keep that page and then they go and they will score a destination. Well, if we've got 100 market sites using IP redirect, then it's going to pick and choose across all of those. But that page is still there. And for certain queries, it's there. So the only way we've been able to solve this problem, and in the big picture, it's not a problem, right? It's only a problem to market level SEOs like the New Zealand team. It's like Australia or anybody that's got a global homepage stuck in there that's like, I'm not getting all this credit for, the 500,000 searches for Nike and the 350,000 searches, clicks that are going to Australia or wherever the hell it's going to.
Right.
So
And just so people realize what you're saying here is the link is actually to the virtual page in Google. And so it's going through a redirect. And so once you go through that redirect, you don't get the credit for the entry page to your homepage. And that's an issue with your analytics.
because you don't get the SEO clicks.
Yeah.
Right? Because, and then especially a lot of people that are using Search Console data, they're not seeing it in there. And, and so, I mean, that's the big ticket traffic driver. And so they ultimately get the traffic. Again, this is why IT is like, I don't understand what the problem is. They click it, they come to our site. Well, you want those clicks to show up in your report in the market. So the only way to fix this is that page, that global page that technically doesn't exist, you need to account for it as the X default for the representative homepages. And because the page doesn't exist, you can't use a tag. You have to use an XML sitemap.
Right. So when you say you can't use a tag, you're saying it's impossible to have a tag because you don't have a page.
The tag will never be seen.
Right.
Because the IP redirect, both for Google and any request, anytime that link is clicked anywhere in the world, on the web, on web pages, in search engines, the fact when that request comes in, typically to the CDN, that IP is going to send it somewhere else. That page can never load for Google to see, or any other search engine that uses HREFLang to ever see that tag. But we can present that in an XML sitemap. So through an HREFLang sitemap.
So have you created a HREFLang sitemap for just the home pages if the CMS already has tags on the pages?
Yes.
And you've seen it work?
Yes. Over 100 cases where this is the only way we could solve this problem.
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You could also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group.
Now, think about this, right? So exactly deconstruct in your mind what you just described. So we have the cluster that's linking to all the home pages for all the existing sites. So let's say, just for discussion purposes, we have 100 versions. So all 100 versions, let me keep this simple. We have 100 versions that are publicly available, that are listed on our country selector and our pull downs, and that we have 100 sites. And we have all 100 of them cross-tagged beautifully in tags. We're missing one. We're missing that root page. And so what we will do and you can have this is, because we're not, the only deviation from the cluster in the tags is adding in this page as the X default. So we set the Nike.com, IBM.com as the X default for the home pages. And then we set all of the other market or language pages as their respective languages and markets. Now, what this has done, if you just remember how HREFLang works, we're saying all of these things are interconnected. And guess what? We've now got this X default. The number one question we get is, Bill, on our tags, all of these home pages all have a X default tag elsewhere. Maybe it's to the US, maybe it's to, some people have a global website. And typically those that have a global site, that's, again, if Nike.com has a site, which they do, which is why wasn't comfortable using Nike as our example, but let's say, like an IBM does not. They have a US site, they have a UK site, they have a Canada site. They don't have a no folder before the page scenario. They don't have a proper global site. So because they don't, this is the way for them to solve that problem. Those that do often use a hard 301 to that global one, which means they don't have the root. We've taken care of the root. This is only when you have a 302 from the root using IP detection. So again, this is one where I almost always take people to a whiteboard or draw them a picture, and you talk about it, and then I have a pretty extensive explanation about this particular case on HREFLang Builder, and we do talk about this specifically in the Implementing HREFLang course with pictures and some drawings. But that is the one that's the biggest anomaly now that people see. And I think every international conference I've been to in probably the last 5 years at least, this is a question that comes up. And this is exactly the way that Gary and John recommend people deal with it, because it's technically the only way we can deal with it. And so, again, going back to the bugaboo for people is, but Bill, in my page, I have some other site as the X default. Well, we may have to change it for the X default. So one thing you can do is potentially turn the tags off on the home pages because they're all covered in the XML sitemap. And again, this is another reason why, from day one, well, it's probably day 5 because it took Google 5 days to roll out the XML sitemap solution because all of us big sites complained. But from the moment that XML sitemap was available, I've always leveraged sitemaps so that we had this kind of flexibility to do this and then to do the other one that I want to talk about that you have in your guide about, again, the product side of this, where we have flexibility to insert specific mappings for products, like the scenario you gave earlier that, I sell this. So this is even more of a wild card scenario that people deal with. So one, let's say I sell 2 scenarios. Scenario 1 is I sell this product in 2 German-speaking markets. I sell it in Germany and I sell it in Austria only. So in your HREFLang, whether using tags or XML, they will be mapped, right? So the question is, on these 2 pages, where they only exist in those 2 markets, what does the system use as the X default? In your scenario, it depends on your scenario with your CMS. Some CMSs will, use the German or the Austrian page, whichever dominant parent-child they set up. A lot of times in this scenario, we've got a parent-child where Germany or Austria is the dominant site with a parent site, and then Germany or Austria is the child, in which case it inherits the X default of Germany. It often doesn't roll back to a global level or an English page because there often isn't one, right? So this is an anomaly that, in this case, my recommendation is don't engineer something for this nuance. Just don't use an X default. If you're using XML sitemaps, you could, in theory, map it to a product category page in another market, a similar product in another market. But these are the nuances that you have in e-commerce that I think at the end of the day, it's not worth the engineering resources to try to, sort of wire up some sort of solution. Again, if you're using HREFLang and you can't have an override mapping rule, plug for HREFLang Builder, which I'm only an advisor to. In HREFLang Builder, you can create these more complex one-to-one or one-to-multiple hardwire mappings like this. But I think for most people, I would just rather not use an X default in those scenarios.
Yeah, you don't want to be programming for every single possible scenario that may not exist or only exist in a little bit. Or if you need to do this, like you said, the HREFLang Builder can do this for you. So I don't know anything else that can do that. All right. So I think this is probably a good place to wrap up unless you've got some other things on your mind.
No, I think we're good. I think definitely, check out the article that's there. Like I said, the matrix is good. Bill goes into some great detail about some of the gotchas, just sort of following the general HREFLang standards. Definitely, like I said, I'm going to create this module on this because some of this stuff I think we do have to show in charts and graphs and crayon drawings. And I think just, it is a great way to talk about the other 15 to 20 other nuances that we've encountered over the years that are unique use cases that, it's too hard to put them all into an article. But yeah, check out the article and let us know, if there's anything that is not covered, because I think this is a great resource for you to take to developers and managers to try to convince them to think about X-default a little more functionally.
Yeah, and to add to that, X-default's not a ranking factor. It helps people see a page that isn't targeted to them. It's the fallback page, right? Obviously, if you implement it wrong, HREFLang's not going to work. HREFlang, while we know it works, it doesn't work in every single scenario. There are times where Google decides to pick a different page, but there's no way around that. And there are ways to try to figure out if your HREFlang isn't working properly. We've developed a looker report that will allow you to see what pages are showing up in what regions and how trends change, which would identify maybe changes in traffic based on things that you implement at the time.
A plug for since you mentioned that looker report, in our building your business case, we actually talk about scenarios like the product scenario that Bill mentioned, where we and the client both saw a spike in traffic to the US site from Canada because of this looker report. And then they're like, well, why do we have this anomaly? And it turned out it was a product that originally was launched in the US. And because of the border proximity with the US and Canada, the Canadians were seeing the US commercials on TV and in social media. And so they were searching for it. And what had happened is the team had launched the product in Canada. So originally you could understand why, but this big spike in there, like, well, why are we Canadians still going to America? And what had happened is when they launched the page, the agency did not put in HREFLang. And so there was nothing. And so Canada was working like a free agent, and Google's like, well, we got all this link love and all this other stuff to the US page. So that's what we're going to show to the Canadians. And that's why they were all coming to the US, because they saw it in that looker report. And we talk about that in that course. That report was the trigger, the signal, that single spike. They're like, oh, wow. So they did the mapping for that HREFLang, and immediately that traffic, the US stopped cannibalizing the traffic. And then Google started showing the Canadian page, and all was well in marketing world. So again, that's the value of that looker report too. It's probably one of the best examples I've ever had of why finding and seeing these anomalies that report can tease out can be beneficial to you. And you can get that, it'll be in the show notes. And then Bill's done an article talking about how to use it. And it's a free report. So it's sort of crazy not to take advantage of it.
Right. So yeah, we invite you to check out the article, Mastering HREFLang X-default, and we really hope that you're finding this podcast valuable. If you're enjoying the show, we'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. And we also want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions. We're happy to answer your questions, and any feedback helps motivate us to keep making these and plan future episodes. If you follow International Webmastery on LinkedIn and X, you can post information there. If you join our Facebook group, we have a free Facebook group. We also have a closed Facebook group for people who are paying for our trainings. We're there to answer questions. So while we want you to take our courses, ask the questions and you'll probably see an answer from us. All right, that's all I got.
Cool. All right, see you guys next time.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying HREFLang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.